I wanted to first thank Ron and the team. A lot of great speakers today. Today I want to talk about fortifying your foundation for the next wave of digital, especially if you're a larger enterprise or working within the confines of one. Really want to help you understand some of the themes and patterns that we're instituting as it relates to consulting advice for our customers. A little bit about ahead, our consulting practices primarily serve the Fortune 2000. We do about $1.3 billion in annual gross revenue. We've got about a $200 million service business. We've got roughly around 250 engineers like myself who span everything from traditional infrastructure in the data center to modern application development and DevOps practices, which we'll kind of focus on today. And again, it's really full stop, full service enterprise IT consulting, app modernization, service management, monitoring, as well as security practices, all within our consulting services business. Our headquarters is in Chicago, but we have offices in Atlanta, Nashville, Detroit, and a handful of other locations you see on the map. And as Ron stated, my name is Mike Koleno. I'm the chief architect of our modern applications practice, and I'll be leading us through the conversation today. As it relates to our practice of modern apps and DevOps, we essentially do three things, and that's typically where we're most engaged with customers in the field. We build greenfield cloud-native apps. We modernize existing legacy apps for the cloud in either a cloud-native or cloud-ready fashion. And then lastly, we automate cloud applications and platforms, and that ultimately sort of encapsulates our DevOps practices that sort of go hand in hand as a sort of peanut butter and jelly story with the things that we do from a modern application standpoint. I want to really kind of talk about sort of fortifying your foundation by kind of looking back in the past and really kind of highlighting some of the challenges that have historically presented themselves to the enterprise and why there's really a need to change moving forward. If we look at sort of what I call the first wave of digital, roughly 2008 with the inception of the iPhone and the bringing online of the application stores, you really have this component where mobile and everything associated with responsive web, REST APIs, a lot of new technologies that were just absolutely fundamental in terms of changing the way in which we thought about and think about traditional IT, everything from the systems to the operations. And so if we look at sort of how we sort of met that challenge, it was with a lot of monolithic systems, a bunch of vertical scaling, really didn't have the concepts of horizontal scaling. We heard from the folks previous, Cameron and team about, how and where containers fits into all this. Based off of sort of a rush to plant a flag in the app stores and to get things sort of modernized for the mobile channel. We did a lot of point-to-point integrations in enterprise settings. And then lastly, we've treated data integrations specifically across large enterprises in a very, very traditional way. And there's really an impetus to change that as we move forward. What we're going to look at now is really kind of what I describe as the second wave of digital, which is essentially more sort of fundamental growth and expansion as it relates to some of the more traditional or more recently traditional channels as it relates to digital, so mobile and web. And that's going to continue to bring more opportunities and correspondingly more challenges. We'll dive in a little bit more as it relates to streaming, a data-specific topic, very, very important as it relates to customer expectations today and how some of that traditional data interaction and integration takes place. And then lastly, we're making the statement now that IoT, specifically IoT-based solutions, are ready to be operationalized after years and years of talk, and we see that sort of materializing as it relates to our customers. So, how are we going to attack this sort of next wave of digital? What are the things? What are the wrongs that need to be righted, and subsequently, where do we need to place our bets as it relates to fortifying our foundation? First, we want to move away from the monolithic and the vertical scale and move to more distributed horizontal scale scaling model and architecture. We want to move towards seamless and shared integrations, more building block approaches so that we can share a lot of the work as it relates to integrations. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we want to move away from data as a sort of point in time, sort of snapshot into more streamlining data sharing as it relates to how and when it occurs, which in the real world, we categorize that as events. So today I'm going to talk about the 3 things that you and your teams need to do alongside of the changes that you need to make to your systems to be able to meet the challenge of the next wave of digital. The first is what we call the cloud native shift. And this is really a driver for organizations moving faster, both from a software delivery as well as from a software operation standpoint. We'll talk about this, but we call this the need for speed. Cloud apps and APIs, embracing continuous delivery, continuous deployment, and really evolving your processes as it relates to DevOps. The second, as we talked about previously, we really want to fortify that foundation from an enterprise integration standpoint. We see a lot of our customers making bets in this area, moving away from point-to-point integrations, more streamlined, having the ability to give developers a head start is really key and critical. And then lastly, we want to move away from this traditional ETL and batch integrations as it relates to data that's being shared across specific systems, especially key and critical core systems inside the enterprise. Want to move that to more of a stream-based architecture and really treat data as a priority as opposed to sort of another passenger that's along for the ride. So we're going to dive into these, talk about these in a little bit more detail, and then subsequently open it up for any questions. So first, we talked about the cloud native shift. So as demands on enterprises continue to grow, especially on not only enterprise resources, but the systems themselves, as well as organizations who are looking to capitalize on new opportunities that digital presents them, there's really an impetus for enterprise IT to run faster than it ever has before. The problem with that is we've got a lot of dated architectures from a legacy application standpoint. Got some very, very old processes and workflows that traditionally slow things down and ultimately become a hindrance to organizations moving fast. But if we're able to buck that trend, what we're able to sort of cultivate are some predictable development and deployment cycles from a software delivery standpoint. We have the ability to respond faster to customers than we ever have before. And ultimately, we can support new work streams, those that maybe had to be single-threaded or didn't have the opportunity to be parallelized before. That really is an opportunity for a lot of organizations that we're working with. So the migration to cloud and cloud-ready architectures, cloud-native architectures really has the opportunity to change the game. Again, we sort of centralize on this theme as the sort of the need for speed. And ultimately, as we highlight where the opportunities are, we ultimately see where the challenges are. So as I mentioned before, incremental monolithic design systems that have been around for the last 10, 15, 20, in some cases longer years, their architectures are very, very monolithic in the sense that any change that needs to be made, the entire system needs to be redeployed, which leads to a very arduous regression and deployment cycle. And there's a lot of pain in that. Many of the organizations that we're dealing with or working with that are dealing with these systems, there's so much pain involved that they decide only to take these systems down a handful of times a year. So this is very, very problematic and sort of runs across the grain of what customers expect today in the real world, based off of sort of what the Facebooks and the Googles of the world have sort of laid down in terms of customer expectations in the digital realm. This isn't just a system thing. This is as much of a process and a culture thing. And so siloed collaboration traditionally between application development and our operations teams, those walls need to be brought down in order to really meet the challenges as it relates to running fast for the business. And then lastly, we'll touch on this in a little bit of detail, but this is obviously one of the main talking points of today is moving away from managing lots and lots of infrastructure, and hopefully adopting some of these cloud native platforms that take away the responsibility of ultimately being responsible for managing infrastructure. So these are the traditional challenges, all relating and impacting how fast a business can run. And what's interesting about this is Ahead has gone and invested a significant amount of time and resources. We've done a modern application survey across our entire portfolio of not only clients, but prospects as well. Again, sort of organizations that are dotted across the landscape of the Fortune 2000. And when it comes to top priorities, one of the corresponding questions provided in the survey, enterprise IT leaders came back and said, meeting the needs of the business in order to move faster, delivering better quality software faster, and automating wherever possible. This really just falls in line with, again, the challenges that we've seen organizations suffer from in this particular realm, as well as how and where their business partners want them to go from where they're at today, which is ultimately just moving faster. So how do we go out and actually attack this challenge? What does a modern application and mature DevOps practice look like? We move away from monolithic design. From an application standpoint, we move into cloud-native applications, distributed architectures, event-driven architectures. We move away from manual regression testing, manual deployment. We move into more a test-driven approach, a continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline from a DevOps standpoint. We take down those walls in between application development teams and their operations counterparts, and we figure out how to create co-balanced teams with members from each of the corresponding parties, really build up some shared empathy across those two different personas, the application developer and the operator, really foster a new way of doing things. And then lastly, we move away from the need to wrestle enterprise infrastructure. We lean on cloud native platforms that do a lot of that heavy lifting for us in order for us to be able to focus in on automation, as we saw in the last slide, which again will in turn help us move faster. So I don't want to dismiss that this is just as much about culture and process as it is about everything else that we've seen from a system and an architecture standpoint. One of the things that is very, very noticeable in this new way of working is the human aspect of this. And so one of the things that we talk to our customers about as it relates to bringing these two traditional organizations under enterprise IT, under the enterprise IT umbrella together is really creating a sense of shared empathy and building empathy for the primary passions of corresponding opposite sides of the spectrum or different roles inside the organization, and then putting an empathetic focus on understanding a little bit more about what it's like to walk a mile in that particular persona's shoes. And that has been really, really instrumental as it relates to getting some initial wins in a way which new processes sort of take hold and become the blueprint for operating a new set of processes at scale. The second particular topic that I'd like to dive into is this idea of enterprise integration reboot. Again, very key and critical to fortifying your foundation, especially as you ramp up for the next phase of digital. And again, if we look at some of the challenges that we've created for ourselves as part of the first wave of digital, is we really haven't had a holistic strategy as it relates to integration, and it's created a ton of sprawl. We've also found ourselves in situations where different application development teams are reinventing the same wheel. There's really no coordination as to the core integrations that have been built. And so we see a lot of repetitive rework in many cases in organizations. And that also leads to not only a larger upfront, but a larger maintenance cost as well. Because anytime we want to make a change to core integrations, we have to go back and fix all the different flavors of that. There's really an opportunity, as I stated earlier, to provide developers with a building block type approach to create some foundational integration points, as well as to build a robust set of APIs that give developers a set of tools to work with that get them off of the starting block very, very quickly. And ultimately, at the end, what this should provide is a robust technical foundation that's not only built to meet the needs of the current business, but is going to significantly reduce the amount of effort required in order to meet future business as well. We'll also have the ability, as this sort of new foundation builds up, to start chipping away at the old and retiring some of those point-to-point integrations, which in many cases leads to a smaller overall sort of operating cost as it relates to all the applications and APIs that are available in the function inside the organization. And then lastly, we have the ability to centralize a lot of our core enterprise functionality, and then again sort of federate that out so that different development teams inside the organization can chip away at that. Coming back to our modern application survey, as it relates to, we asked our customers as well as our prospects, what are the top challenges that you and your enterprise IT team face? And again, a lot of particular answers sort of roll up to this. 35% said legacy software is inflexible and complex, right? We want to, as part of the enterprise integration reboot, we really want to make this streamlined and easy for developers. There's too much custom software, right? So this is the sprawl idea. If everyone has to go out and create an integration point to system A, and there's 10 teams that want that, and none of them know of the existing interfaces to system A, all 10 teams are going to go out and create 10 different variations of that, and it just becomes a lot to manage. Unsure of when to rebuild or replace legacy software. Again, if we centralize the integration functionality, there's a team that's managing that, and they know what decisions to make in that particular realm. And then lastly, business units, as I mentioned prior, business units have been forced to go out and develop software on their own, really starting from ground zero, and we want to sort of eliminate that as a primary challenge. What are some of the enterprise, if we go in and integrate and reboot the way that enterprise integrations have been built up, what are some of the outcomes and the benefits? There's going to be a ton of efficiencies gained. We talked about that, giving developers a head start. It's also going to allow us to recover from incidents when they come up, especially as it relates to some of these core integrations are, the highest level severity defects and issues when those systems go down. And rather than having to comb through a list of integrations that do the same thing, the core enterprise integration team knows exactly how that integration is being held up across the organization, and they know how to go in and fix it. It's going to give us a reduced operation cost and risk. You wouldn't be surprised to see how many very large traditional integration tools, the IBMs and the Oracles of the world, those tool sets are used in many cases all over large organizations, and many organizations are moving away from them, primarily from a cost standpoint. The second is that they carry a lot of risk just based off of the fact that they have been behind in terms of patching and staying up to date from a release standpoint. Many of these systems have become end of life or end of support. So we really want to take this opportunity to reduce our risk, align with, I would say, which is much more popular, commercial open source tools, and potentially get away from the overbearing costs of some of these traditional tools. We also are going to, again, meet the needs as part of this of the digital customer. Again, because we're providing that sort of enterprise integration foundation, it's going to allow developers to sort of build on top of the building blocks that we provide them, and ultimately it's going to equate to a faster time to market. And then lastly, we haven't had too much time to talk about this, but there's a real opportunity here to support new initiatives and revenue streams, especially as it relates to API integration, data integration, and really fortifying that, and then having that as an offering to provide either directly back out to customers or downstream or upstream to other organizations and suppliers and partners. It's a really real opportunity for our customers. The last thing I want to talk about real quickly is moving away from those traditional ETL and batch integrations as it relates to data. And we really want to think about data as it relates to processing in the future in a manner of streams processing. So as our dependency on data grows, making data available specifically when users and systems need it is going to become even more paramount. And so the most relevant data to systems and users at the time at which it happens will ultimately allow us to make better, faster, smarter decisions. These batch integrations have been, traditionally very cumbersome to manage, whereas a lot of the newer streaming technologies make it very, very seamless to get systems to be able to communicate with each other, specifically with data going across in the corresponding piping and plumbing. Data is going to arrive on time. We're going to have the ability to subscribe to events or types or classes of events. And when something happens, very much in line with an event in the real world from a system standpoint, the corresponding consumers who are subscribed to that particular event are going to be notified. And then at that particular point in time, data has already arrived at their doorstep. So that, along with the fact that we are going to rely on on commercially open source tools, many of which have been proven out by the LinkedIns, the Lyfts, the Ubers of the world. So battle tested from a global scale standpoint. And ultimately, we're going to move to a point where data becomes a very strategic asset. And I think that's a difference from the way that enterprise IT has looked at it in the last 5 to 10 years. What does this batch to real time sort of conversion look like? So if you look at the bottom, everyone who's in a large organization should be aware of batch integrations. Data arrives on particular intervals, and then correspondingly, once the data leaves its corresponding source, data that arrives and is subsequently set out in the next transmission is relatively stale, depending on when it was sent in and when the next transmission goes out. If we contrast that to what we see up at the top, where data continues to arrive in these different partitions or pipes, formerly known as topics, we have the opportunity to subscribe to those particular events. And then again, as an event or a scenario unfolds in the real world, that data is made available to us in our doorstep from a system standpoint. And again, we can provide that back to either downstream systems for decisioning or to the user specifically themselves. As it relates to our process, we typically dig in with our customers. We transform batch integrations into real time in a 4-step method. We identify the batch transmissions where migrating to more of a real-time integration would be valuable. In some cases, it's not. And so our pragmatic approach is, we want to focus on the things that provide value. We want to look at, what the batch header and payload looks like. We want to get an understanding of whether or not that still makes sense. In many cases, we're 5, 10, 15 years out from when the original data set was even looked at. So we want to take the opportunity to go and look at that again. And then transitioning, we leverage, as I mentioned, the sort of planet and global scale technology that's most prevalent today from a streaming standpoint is Apache Kafka. We leverage that quite heavily as it relates to our customers. And then we sort of figure out a way to modify sort of the source and target sort of integration types and corresponding plumbing. We put the new sort of Kafka partition or topic down, and then subsequently flip the light switch on from what's traditionally been a batch integration to more of a real-time integration, which again, in many cases just changes everything from what the consumer sees to, in some cases, downstream systems in terms of processing when these events occur. So very, very exciting. And again, another formidable piece of what's required to build a robust foundation for the future. So in a summary, we've talked about the 3 things that are required to fortify your foundation for the next wave of digital. We've talked about how cloud-native architectures, how DevOps processes and culture provide the first piece, which is the cloud-native shift. We've talked about rebuilding the core integrations inside of large organizations to provide developers with the building blocks, which will in turn enable them to move faster. And then lastly, we've talked about moving away from some of the traditional batch integrations and really elevating the priority associated with data and moving from traditional ETL to streaming. Again, my name is Mike Koleno. I have my email address here. You have ways to get in contact with me as well through Ron. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. Ron, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Mike. We've got a few minutes now before we bring up Paul from Amazon. Mike, one of the questions came up, and you're ideally positioned to answer this, was do you have any general guidance on what type of applications are well suited to migrating to the cloud, what types aren't? I suggested to Saeed who asked this question, and this is true for all of the participants, there's really no magic answer. A lot depends on your situation. A lot depends on your regulatory requirements. When do you have to keep certain data on-prem? The only suggestion I have is I go back to the big banks. When you've got a huge IBM mainframe running COBOL programming that's mission critical, you probably don't want to move that to the cloud first. But aside from that one recommendation for me, maybe Mike, you might be able to offer some general guidance. And if people have specific questions about their environments, just email me, or you see Mike's email address. The folks at Ahead are absolutely and ideally suited for answering this kind of question.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that, Ron. It's a really good question. Again, our approach is very, very pragmatic. And why I say that is there's a lot of consulting firms that would come in and tell you, it's a big bang. Its entire portfolio needs to move from on-prem to the cloud. We don't necessarily believe that at all. I think where we really need to focus is from a value standpoint. And the way that this traditionally breaks down for our customers, I would say, there's a large focus or contingent of applications that do not need to be modified whatsoever. And in some regards, how and where they're architected as well as where they're hosted is absolutely fine, and it doesn't warrant the investment to move them either to VMs in the cloud or to modernize them. And I think that, this is a lot of utility type applications, things that, are updated maybe once or twice a year, really are used for internal use cases or partner use cases, et cetera. I think there's another set of applications that are going to, as we sort of walk up this 3-step hierarchy, the next would be applications that we want to make cloud ready. So those that would fundamentally benefit from the fact that there's enough sort of value there, there's enough change that's instituted into the application development ecosystem, into the system ecosystem, to potentially make some modifications, get those to be able to be run in the cloud, hopefully in some sort of container-based or application-specific abstraction, which again gets us out of the business of trying to leverage VMs in the cloud, which is ultimately just more to manage. So cloud-ready, containerizing applications, putting pipelines around them, that would be sort of the second tier. And then I think the third tier is really kind of 5 to 10% of your application portfolio. Those are the applications that are ripe for true application modernization, moving away from monolithic architectures to distributed architecture, moving to microservices, in a similar way, hosting those on some sort of container or application abstraction in the cloud. And the reason why we're doing that is, one, many of those systems are the largest money makers inside of the walls of the organization. Two, there's just no shortage of demand to the changes that are required to those particular systems, as well as the downstream and the upstream consumers that ultimately also are in many cases interfacing with customers. So those are the places where there's a real opportunity to go in very surgically and to modernize those applications similar to what we do at Ahead, and move those in a much more diligent and heavy construction type of way, to really kind of re-cement the foundation in a more of a distributed systematic way, where we have the ability now at that point to, again, run development streams in parallel, have a cart team, have a product catalog team. They have different release cycles, potentially different tooling. But again, that's only 5 to 10% of the application portfolio. If you did that everywhere, you're not making the right investment. So that's typically how it breaks down in our world, Ron.